establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Nana Akue, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Good evening, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. State of the Nation tonight. The Chancellor's financial statement yesterday continues to dominate the public debate. To tax or to cut, that is the question. In a moment, I will be joined by former Business Secretary and Liberal Democrat Titan Sir Vince Cable to unpick the outcome of the last 2 days. And to paraphrase the apparently well-known artist Keisha, TikTok on the clock. The party has come to a stop, at least for the use of the Chinese-owned video sharing app on government telephones. If it's too dangerous for them, why isn't it too dangerous for my children? And the Eton mess created by cricket authorities at Lords after the harrowing decision to relocate an iconic annual cricket match reaches a compromise, with the Eton and Harrow match back at Lords, and I'm going to be joined by legendary cricket player Pat Pocock. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be hearing from our acclaimed panel, Director General of the Free Speech Union, Toby Young, and author and journalist, Ella Whelan. As ever, I want to hear from you. Please get in touch by emailing mailmog@gbnews.uk. But before all of that, it's been another busy day, and here to keep us up to date is Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. The top story today on GB News. The government has agreed a pay offer with health unions representing nurses, ambulance staff and other NHS workers in England. They'll receive a consolidated pay increase of 5% and an additional lump sum worth at least £1,655 if they back it. Health unions have now suspended all planned strikes and are recommending their members accept the deal in an upcoming ballot. And that comes after health workers in Scotland, represented by the GMB union, accepted a 6.5% pay offer from the Scottish Government. The Prime Minister says today's agreement is a message to other unions to stop the strikes and start talks.
We want to have constructive dialogue with unions. We're serious about finding fair and reasonable agreements on public sector pay. I think today's agreement demonstrates that. And what I'd say to all other unions is, please don't be striking. Please come in and have those talks. We've been wanting to do that, and today's agreement demonstrates we're serious about it. We don't want disruption.
Well, speaking to GB News this afternoon, the head of health at Unison, Sarah Gorton, said they want this to be the start of the government and unions working together to make a difference.
Well, I think the moral of the story is that when government works with trade unions, we can actually deliver something that might make a difference to the health service. So, we want to see this as the start of a process where government actually listens to trade unions and accepts that we're the voice of health workers and wants to work with us constructively.
Well, separately, junior doctors belonging to the British Medical Association are yet to resolve their pay dispute. However, they have welcomed an invitation to negotiate from the government, with talks set to take place tomorrow. Full details on the outcome of that, if any, right here on GB News. Now, also in government news today, Oliver Dowden says Grant Shapps should not hold sensitive government documents on his personal phone, describing it as a risk. And that comes after the Energy Secretary said he wouldn't be deleting TikTok, the app on his phone, despite concerns over security. Earlier, Mr Dowden placed an immediate ban on the app on all government devices. The Cabinet Minister says the decision is a precautionary measure.
Will have received separate briefing in respect of how he should use his personal device, and that would include not having sensitive government documents on his personal device. It is just a fact that the ultimate ownership of TikTok is from a Chinese entity, and those entities are subject to Chinese national security laws. So it may not be the case that this is happening now, and I don't have any evidence to suggest that that is the case, but that it is a risk.
You're up to date. Now back to Jacob. More headlines for you at 9.
The budget, as Gilbert said of the House of Lords, did nothing in particular, but did it rather well. It steadied the ship, calmed the waves and poured oil on troubled waters. But it didn't really deal with the fundamental problem that we face in our economy, and that is the state taxes and spends far too much. Both taxation and spending are too big a share of the national income. And this has got worse following the pandemic because there seems to be an assumption that every problem must be solved by the state, whether it's childcare or any issue that arises. It's expected that your big brother in the state can come in, hold you by the hand and do things for you. But I firmly believe that money is better spent by you, the people who earned it, rather than the state. Why is that? Well, you have a greater concern as to whether it is spent well, whether you get a return on it if you're investing, whether it provides you with what you want in terms of services, whether it's done properly, whether there is efficiency when you're getting served. Whereas if you're spending other people's money, it's so much easier to be cavalier about it. And that's not that the bureaucratic beast of the civil service is incompetent, but it's just the incentives aren't right. They're not there to be either frugal or efficient. And the civil service itself, of course, has got very large. Boris Johnson, when he was leading the government, wanted to cut the civil service by £91,000. £91,000, no, much more than that, 91,000 individuals. But unfortunately, when the current Prime Minister took office, that plan went. And that's a real problem because cutting 91,000 civil servants doesn't only save their wages and the costs of employing them, but it also stops them thinking up lots of rules that may get in the way of your life and may cost more money as they put burdens onto the economy. You may be able to get efficient services delivered with fewer people, and that should be the aim, because yesterday the civil service, perhaps in not such a civil way, engaged in collective inaction. And I just wonder if anyone noticed. Probably not. People may have noticed the junior doctor's absence, or indeed the teacher's absence, and certainly people coming in here noticed the strikes on the railways and the underground, but not the civil servants. Now some of them weren't working from home. They actually came in to picket their offices, which is great. The only way to get people into the office is to get them to picket it, which has a certain illogicality about it. But that was what was happening yesterday. People came in, stood outside their offices, and marvellous to see them back. But that wasn't quite what I intended when I put notes on their desk saying I hope to see them back in due course. I thought they'd come into work rather than to picket. But there is a lot of fat within the system that we need to be getting rid of. In the UK, those working for the civil service have a much better payment base when it comes to pensions. 26 to 30% of their salary is added to their pension compared to 4% for those in the private sector. So you're talking about 6 or 7 times the private sector's pension accumulation, including on top of earnings that are slightly ahead of those in the private sector. So when you take into account the pension benefits, they're doing much better, and they work 5 hours fewer per week than the national average. So that's why we want to be cutting back on the civil service, cutting back on what they do, so that people can do more things for themselves, spending their own money. To go back to the fundamental point that we started with, we don't need as many people as we have got, and we don't need them to have these extraordinary feather-bedded terms in comparison. But there are more savings to be had than that. Anyone who interacts with the government knows that there is waste. We're still spending £11 billion on our foreign aid budget, even after it has been cut. Even Wes Streeting, the shadow health secretary, has said that the NHS is in dire need of reform. And this is really important because the Labour analysis of the NHS for decades has been just give them more money, whereas Wes Streeting is saying, let's make sure the money is spent better. And that's fundamentally important. And we should obviously save the money by scrapping HS2, the costs of which go up and up and up. The years go by. It seems to be an endless delay when in the 19th century we could build railways quite quickly. Now it takes decades and costs billions for a service that people aren't using anymore, not least perhaps because they keep on going on strike. Added to that is a welfare system that we revealed on this programme recently pays universal credit to people earning up to £125,000. And this was something that the coalition government tried to stop in 2010. How can it have crept back? Isn't that just a waste of your money? And that's one of the absolutely key points, that it is your money. There has been for too long the notion of the government's money, but there's no such thing. It is taxpayers' money. It is your money. And it is your money that you ought to keep because fundamentally you spend it better. And that's what we needed from the budget. We need a smaller state doing less better and allowing people to keep their own money, which will ensure that the economy grows. Now, I always want your views. You probably know the email off by heart by now. If you do, you're doing better than me. I've got to read it from a screen, but it's mailmog@gbnews.uk. And now I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Vince Cable, very distinguished former leader, key part of the coalition in the coalition years when we were for 5 years on the same side most of the time. What would you have done differently in the budget?
Well, actually, there were 1 or 2 things that I thought were good. I don't agree with you about the childcare. I thought that was a good supply-side initiative, helping low-earning families particularly get people back into work. I thought that the improvements in investment allowances, the capital allowance, was a good move, helped to offset some of the negatives around business investment. But, I mean, the overall problem with the budget is that the public sector is hemmed in by, very demanding debt levels of precariousness, particularly after the adventures of the Truss Kwarteng years. There are a lot of scrutiny from bond markets and very little the government can do. You ask what I would do. I don't share your view about the size of the state. I don't think we should be frightened about the level of taxation and government spending at the moment. By international standards, it's not exceptional. Countries like Denmark have far, far higher levels of state spending and taxation than we do. We're pretty efficient, well-run, open market economies. So I think where necessary, you have to recognise the need for higher taxes, and the IFS pointed this out yesterday. We are going to go through several years of high levels of taxation. That's not, to your point about government has to be efficient. I completely agree with that. I tried to set an example in government. In my department, which I think you briefly led, we cut our overheads 40%, and we cut spending overall by 25% in the 5 years I was there. So it's actually set an example in being more economic. And of course there is waste. I mean, government procurement in the pandemic was unbelievably awful. And I'd be inclined to add to that the enormous number of civil servants who were hired for Brexit preparations too, and subsequently put on all these bilateral trade negotiations rather than dealing with the World Trade Organization. So there are areas where I would cut, but I think overall, to finance the level of state that we have and public services that are quite stretched in many areas, education, a lot of local authority functions, we've got to pay for it.
But this is going to be very tough for people, isn't it, because of the fiscal drag effect, that governments can get away with not raising thresholds when inflation is 1 or 2%. But when it's up to 10%, that is going to make a real and noticeable effect on people's standard of living.
I do agree with you, certainly at the lower end of the scale. In fact, one of the things we did in the coalition, if you remember, was even under very difficult circumstances,
it was one of the best things we
kept lifting the threshold, and that was absolutely the right priority. It was keeping low earners out of tax. If you're at the bottom end of the income scale, these are the people with the highest marginal rate of tax, because there's a combination of taxation and the tapering of benefits. So, yeah, we do have a responsibility there.
And that hits them quite quickly, but then they need to be given benefits to make up for it. So you get an additional cost of administrating the benefits that you're giving because you're taking extra tax from people who are actually low earners.
Well, actually, I think the universal credit system, although one can argue that it's defective in all kind of ways, and in my view, not particularly generous, and the restrictions on numbers of children, seem to me quite wrong. But it's a much more efficient system, and I disagree with the IDS on an awful lot of things, but I think it deserves some credit for bringing in a much simpler system of benefit. I think it combines 6 or 7 of the leading benefits.
And to go back to what you were saying on the corporation tax and the write-offs for investment, the ABR, and I'm not a great fan of the ABR, has said that actually all this will do is bring investment forward. Do you think, as I do, it's actually better to keep low rates and not have so many write-offs rather than to complicate the tax system with ways of getting back the tax?
Well, low rates were one of the key mantras of George Osborne when we were in the coalition. I think the evidence suggests that it didn't actually have the effect we'd hoped on attracting new investment. Something that was more targeted, whether the super deduction or the capital allowances is a better way of doing that. As you say, it's a temporary measure, but of course it could be rolled over. I mean, the problem that we're trying to deal with, and we agree, I think, is the desperate need for more private investment, business investment. But what is holding it back, isn't just tax rates. You've got higher cost of capital because of rising interest rates, weak demand. I would argue the Brexit effect was very substantial. So there's a combination of things holding back private investment.
But we've had a productivity problem for about 30 years now, and nobody seems to work out what's causing it. And if you can't work out what's causing it, it's very hard to find a solution to it.
Well, I was lecturing students in economics 50 years ago, and we were worrying about the productivity problem then. And that generation's solution was, well, you join the European Union because you then get more competition and economies of scale and so on. And enough said about that. But you're right, we need, what is the underlying problem? There is a labour productivity issue, but I think it's much less. Certainly in the last 20 years, you've now got very flexible labour markets we didn't have before.
And to what extent do you think it is that relatively low-cost immigration has stopped companies investing, and that's made it too easy for companies just to increase output by taking on cheap labour rather than investing in new machinery?
Well, there was probably an element of that, but actually, I think most of the immigration which we had before the change in the regime was in areas which were actually complementary to things happening in the economy. Things like agricultural workers, hospitality sector that were never going to, you can't automate anyway. The nature of those services industries is that they are very labour intensive, relatively low wage. So there is an element of substitution between capital investments and labour, but not a great deal. Well, what's happened since, as you know, we've got continued very high net immigration, mostly skilled labour from outside the European Union. I think it's a good policy if it's sustained. But I don't think that when we had free movement, I don't think that did an enormous damage to automation and capital investment.
Well, thank you very much for coming in. It is a real pleasure to have Sir Vince in. He is one of the most thoughtful members of the Lib Dems and a very distinguished former cabinet minister. But don't forget to let me know what you think. Again, it's mailmog@gbnews.uk. And after the break, it's TikTok Goes the Clock for a popular Chinese-owned social media company. You won't want to go anywhere.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512,
Virgin Media Channel 604,
Freesat Channel 216,
Freeview Channel 236,
and YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Jim, pay attention, because I think I covered this. Nobody ever seems to talk about the very generous pensions the public servants receive when they go on strike for higher pay. They are subsidised by the taxpayers. Well, I actually think I gave the figures earlier. Perhaps you sent the message in before I'd started. Bert, Jacob, the government spends other people's money. Excellent. Bert has been listening. The taxpayers, government doesn't have any money of its own. So when we see our money funding migrant hotels, health and benefits, while we don't have a dentist ourselves, it's just plain wrong. And Emily, we need to cut taxes because that means that our economy will grow. In a sentence, you have hit the nail on the head. TikTok, on the clock in China. His Majesty's government has banned TikTok, the Chinese video sharing app, on all official devices. We're following the United States, Canada, several European nations, and even our friends on the European Commission in banning the said act. Is this popular, whimsical app just some fun for our children, Or is it a sinister tool of indoctrination used by the Communist Party of China to steal our data via the back door? And if it is, why are we only banning it on official government devices? Are the people not also worthy of the state's protection? Or is this, in fact, just an overreaction? Now, I must confess that I allow my children, allow isn't really the right word, I can't stop my children using this app, so it may be that the government couldn't stop us using it, but I do wonder if it's too dangerous for a Secretary of State, surely it's too dangerous for my children. Anyway, I've got a brilliant panel with me today, Toby Young of the Free Speech Union and author and writer Ella Whelan to discuss this with me. Ella, are you taking TikTok off your telephone if you had it there in the first place?
I'm far too old for TikTok. It's something that is definitely for a younger generation. I mean, you know, the interesting thing, I'm surprised that any people who work in government would have it on their phone anyway, unless they're kind of spending their time watching cat videos. There's probably a few apps, as you well know, that a lot of ministers might be and politicians might be deleting off their phone. That's kind of seems to me pretty bog standard. And I also think there's a sort of element of not quite virtue signalling, but it's this kind of tokenistic, because if the government is worried about influence from the Communist Party, well, there's, you know, this sort of thorny issue of Hinkley Point. You know, this is sort of, if you really want to do something in terms of make a sort of stand against alleged Chinese influence or spying or whatever, this is kind of paltry.
Toby, you're always in favour of free speech, so you can't be in favour of banning anything, can you?
Well, I'm actually quite sympathetic to banning the use of TikTok on ministers' phones. There is, when you sign up to TikTok, you grant TikTok the right to access your data, including your contacts, and it also keeps a track of where you are geographically. So I think, you know, if ministers can be tracked in that way, if their contacts can be hacked effectively via
the app. Well, can't they be tracked by the CCTV, which is all Chinese anyway?
Well, that may be true, and maybe they should think about banning that too. But, I mean, you know, the company that owns TikTok maintains it's a private company, and there is a kind of Chinese wall, as it were, between it and the Chinese Communist Party. But under China's intelligence laws, the Chinese government can at any point demand that a private company cooperate, turn over their data. So I think for security reasons it does seem sensible, and we're just following in the footsteps, as you said, of the EU, the US, India, Belgium. So it seems like a kind of fairly elementary precaution. If ministers still want to use it, like Greg Shapps, they still can. Grant Shapps, they can just do it on their private phones rather than their official phones.
Ella, do you think it really matters, or is it essentially trivial whether people use TikTok or not, and that we're getting sort of very frightened, it sort of reds under the bed territory?
Well, I mean, Toby makes a good point in terms of, you know, I think there probably is, and there was a sort of revelation a few months ago about the fact that there had been chips in cars that were being used by ministers and by politicians to be ferried around, and that you know, information could be gathered about their whereabouts. And I suppose, I mean, I'm not a detective, I suppose that could be useful to someone at some point. But I think in terms of, you know, having access to independent media or problems with the internet and privacy and things like that, I mean, we've got our own homegrown problems with that, you know.
Well, haven't we given up that actually our telephones tell everything about us, and that they can be hacked by hostile states if they feel like it, and that TikTok is tokenistic, that so much of our data is open anyway. If somebody wanted to know where any of the three of us was and they could be bothered, they'd find it out very quickly, wouldn't they?
Yes, they could, and I think probably there is an element of, I mean, I mentioned Hinkley Point, there's an element of this sort of kind of being a tokenistic measure, I think, or at least a sort of a display of being seen to do something about China, which isn't going to particularly help a kind of growing East-West, you know, a pretty serious East-West tension for kind of broader discussions about geopolitics. But in terms of, you know, most of us aren't saying anything interesting that the Chinese state or anyone else wants to know about. But there is, if we want to talk about sort of freedom online, free speech online, privacy, things like that, I mean, we're not quite at the CCP level, but we're not far behind in terms of the way in which our government, and whether it's through the online safety bill and different pieces of legislation, polices and controls what we can see and interact with.
Well, we have more CCTV in this country than almost any other country in the world, I think, proportionate population, China may be up there with us. Are you worried about this, but particularly from the Chinese angle? Do you think they can be bothered to follow us so closely?
Well, I suppose in some ways perhaps we're kind of flattering ourselves if we imagine that, you know, there are armies of spies sitting in some big anonymous building in Beijing monitoring our movements or the movements of junior government ministers. But, you know, and of course, if they wanted to hack, you know, other apps on our phones, they probably could. But why make it easy for them? And another consideration is that Instagram, Facebook and Twitter are all banned in China. So, you know, for the Chinese to now kick up a fuss about this seems a little bit hypocritical.
Oh, so you think we should do tit for tat? But isn't that where trade wars start? Isn't this terrible policy, actually, and that we shouldn't be so fretful? Ella? You've said Hinkley Point, that's really major. TikTok is small potatoes.
Well, I mean, the reality is the government needs China's. I mean, we need China's money. So this is, this is why I'm kind of being flippant about this, because it's small fry in terms of actually engaging in any kind of serious discussion about what these two countries, the relationship that these two, the fraught relationship that these two countries have. But if we want to talk about security in Parliament and, you know, spies and access to information, things like that, there does seem to be a bit of an issue. You know, whether it's certain politicians blabbing to people at the bar or having sort of suspect friends or things like that. I think most people, you know, would say that that's a discussion about that is probably not trivial.
Or giving all their WhatsApp messages to a journalist,
Exactly.
which didn't need particular Chinese spying. Thank you to my brilliant panel. Still ahead, a group have compared Britain's protest laws to El Salvador. The cheek of it. We'll be back in one of Kipling's unforgiving minutes.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends were like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and Tory. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Welcome back to State of the Nation. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. James says, for too long the Tory governments were too close with China. It's about time we started decoupling. Philip, it's just an app for children. Why would our politicians have it on their phones to begin with? And that may be a very good point. Perhaps politicians shouldn't try to be too trendy. I have tried in the past, but never very successfully. Jane says, Jacob, do you use TikTok? Well, my watch goes TikTok if you listen very carefully, but that's as close as I get to it. But the UK, our country, has been downgraded on an annual global index of civic freedoms as it sits on a par with El Salvador. A report into civil liberties has found that the UK is one of the worst nations in Western Europe to participate in peaceful protest. The Global Alliance of Civil Society Groups, Civicus, has deemed the UK to be in rapid decline in civic freedoms after it assessed the civil liberties of over 200 countries. The downgrading of the UK in the list is said to be from the effects of the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act, which gave the police new powers to restrict public assemblies and guerrilla-style protesting. But is it really right to name the UK a country of concern for putting some boundaries in place to stop the disruption of normal day-to-day life? I'm very pleased to be joined now by David Haig. David, thank you so much for coming on. Do you really think we're as bad as El Salvador?
Good evening, Jacob. I think in terms of the potential of the laws that have changed, the ones that you mentioned, which concern the regulation of protests and the powers of the police to stop them, and then also arrest and seek prosecutions against the protesters, the scope of those laws are on a par with some of the other countries in those rungs. But obviously there's a very different, from a human rights perspective, in terms of the way that the application of that justice is in England. We have fair courts, we have fair trials. So it is a little bit different to, I think, other countries, but it's certainly a very worrying confirmation, really, because this is not new news as such. We've seen the protests, and we've seen various bodies like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch already raise concerns, but it is going in the wrong direction. It would be, I think, from a human rights perspective, better to be further up the list, heading down the list.
And where would you draw the line? Because I find this very difficult. I'm very much in favour of the right of freedom to protest, but I also don't want the motorways to be shut every other day. Where do you draw the line?
Well, actually, I think, like you said, you've got a very good point. I mean, England's got a very, very proud history of protests that effectively changed history in and around the world, whether it's slavery or the suffragettes and women's rights, and more recently. But quite rightly, also, you have to balance the rights of people that want to go about their daily business and not be stopped from doing that with the right to protest. And that is a very difficult balancing act. And these the Civicus recently and other human rights organisations are of the view that England has got it wrong, the Great Britain's got it wrong, and we're going in the wrong direction. But like I said, I mean, the one, I think, positive thing from all of this is that we obviously are a nation that has better human rights than, in general, than the likes of El Salvador and other concerning countries in the same band that we've been put in by Civicus.
Well, thank you, David. And one of the great glories of our constitution is we have jury trials, and they tend to throw out stupid prosecutions if the state becomes overbearing. But thank you again, David. I'm now joined by my panel, the distinguished free speech warrior Toby Young, an author and journalist, Ella Whelan. Toby, you're in favour of freedom of speech. Do you think the police, etc. bill went too far?
Well, I think as you say, it's difficult to get the balance right. There was certainly a great deal of public opposition to the form that various environmental activist protests took. Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, Insulate Britain. They did disrupt people's day-to-day business. In some cases, they made it difficult for emergency vehicles to reach hospitals and so on and so forth. I think one person died as a result of protesters obstructing traffic because they couldn't get to hospital on time. And, you know, everyone was complaining at the time the police are standing by, not doing enough. Why are they letting this take place? Well, actually, they didn't have the powers to intervene, and the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill grants them those powers. I mean, of course, I'm concerned, and I, like you, support the right to protest, but I think, you know, you have to get the balance right, and I'm not sure that, you know, this report should be taken that seriously. I mean, I run a lobby group, I know that in order to attract attention to reports, you have to have an eye-catching headline. I Googled the former CEO of Civicus before coming on. He was the WEF's Young Global Leader of the Year in 2012. He writes for The Guardian. He used to run deputy director of a left-wing think tank called IPPR, and he's currently the CEO of Ofcom. So I think, of Oxfam. So I think we have to take his report with a pinch of salt.
So he's aiming to get a bit of publicity. Ella, where do you think the line should be drawn? I think that gluing yourself to the ground ought not to be lawful protest because you're causing a public nuisance. But going back and forth across a zebra crossing seems to me to be perfectly legitimate because you're not breaking the law in your form of protest.
Well, it's interesting the words we use because protest does have to be, and if it's going to be successful, it does have to be a nuisance. It does have to be disruptive. It does have to tick people off. It can have sort of quite extreme consequences. We know that the strikes in the NHS at the moment could cause people to become seriously ill or die because workers aren't doing the jobs that, they're out on the picket line rather than doing their jobs. So are we going to ban nurses from going on strike in case someone dies? I think it's interesting. A lot of us, when discussing this, we say, well, I believe in the freedom of protest, but, and there's always a but, and I think I'm much clearer on this, which is that I think the police bill went way too far in terms of the government trying to, I think, gain some kind of credibility by riding the wave of criticism, rightful criticism against Extinction Rebellion, who annoyed all of us in the nation, but took it to the level at which it's now nigh on impossible to have a successful protest. So you have a government that can change the goalposts in terms of what's disruptive. Ministers can change the language to close down a protest. You've got ridiculous rules in the police in terms of defining what's noisy or not. And, to the average punter, it looks like the government has just decided to, riding on the back of this sort of take back control, we're all for democracy wave post-Brexit, to insulate itself from public criticism entirely.
But do you think the level of nuisance is what achieves reform? Because I think there's a very interesting argument on whether the suffragists or the suffragettes achieved more. That the suffragists made the argument and were winning the argument, and then when the suffragettes started blowing up postboxes, people thought, this is something we can't give into, and they actually possibly delayed votes for women by the extremity of their action.
Well, one of my great political heroes is Sylvia Pankhurst, who not only didn't play by the rules, but most certainly had a sense of the idea that it was power in ordinary working class people who made change in politics. And I think that it depends how you look at how social change happens. I think most people are probably sick of being told to approach things softly. Some of the great gains in society, as you well know, are being, like myself, a supporter of Brexit. A lot of the pressure on the government to, when we were faced with sort of rows about Article 50, faced with rows about second referendums, a lot of the pressure on politicians to do the right thing came from people taking to the streets, came from people stopping traffic in motorways, came from people voicing their kind of political anger. And I think that that's where, things happen in Parliament that are important. Parliamentary politics is important. But ultimately, for me, political change and power comes from the outside. And it's not a good look for a government to try and clamp down on people's individual freedoms to voice their political concerns and argue for a political future.
But Toby, isn't it free speech that really changes things? Winning the argument actually matters, whereas going on to a motorway gantry and stopping the traffic doesn't.
Yes, I think that's right. I don't think the tactics of these extreme environmentalists actually helped their cause, and often they were trying to shut down free speech. So they made a lot of noise outside the offices, I think, of Tufton Street headquarters of various right-of-centre lobby groups, and they at one point stopped newspapers being distributed by, newspaper publishers. So obstructing people's free speech, attacking people who have a different point of view to you. I don't think that's the way to win the argument in the public square. One further point on this, Jacob, I don't take the Labour Party, who are revelling in this report comparing us to El Salvador, I don't take their criticisms of this particular act particularly seriously, because Stella Creasy prominent backbench Labour MP, has just successfully amended the public order bill currently going through Parliament to make it illegal to protest within a 150-metre radius.
165 yards. For
165 yards of an abortion clinic. And that it doesn't just ban noisy protesters, it also bans people engaged in silent prayer, which seems like an even more assault, an even greater assault on our civil liberties than anything in the police crime courts and sentencing bill.
We discussed the thought crime last week, and it's the first time there's ever been a thought crime in UK law. Thank you so much to my panellists for brilliant discussion. Coming up next, in the latest twist between tradition and the ever-looming threat of the woke, it's been quite a match. Up until then, keep Mogg on the box.
Coming up on Dan Wootton tonight, in an exclusive sit-down with Priti Patel, the former Home Secretary gives her bombshell takes on the witch hunt against Boris Johnson.
The lack of transparency, the lack of accountability. I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
Shamima Begum's bid to return.
I have seen the security and intelligence information.
And there's a few home truths for Gary Lineker.
You know, I've experienced such comments from him as well when I was Home Secretary.
Don't miss Dan Wootton tonight, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB Plus Radio
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned.
I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to State of the Nation with me, Jacob Rees-Mogg. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Jeff, did you ever encounter a civil servant gluing themselves to their sofa so they didn't have to come back to the office And did you support their right to do it? Well, I hope they had very good glue if they were glued to the sofa. David says, there's nothing wrong with El Salvador's laws. Since Nayib Bukele took power, the country has become far safer. Well, I think we should have a discussion on the politics of El Salvador with David in some future show. And Tina, Jacob, I was wondering about your thoughts on the near banking crisis today. Tina, that is extremely important and could have taken a whole programme by itself. I think the intervention of the Swiss Central Bank has proved crucially important. The Marylebone Cricket Club has voted to keep playing the Harrow versus Eton match, a match that dates back to 1805, won more often by Eton than by Harrow, as I'm sure you all wanted to know. And it's always been played at Lord's Cricket Ground. And in a frightfully woke and pompous effort to diversify, which actually meant they were giving the games to the sponsors who paid them a lot of money for it, the MCC thought it'd be a good idea to get rid of their most historic match, a match that took place before Nelson had won the Battle of Trafalgar, which came, as you all know, on the 21st of October 1805. It was the woke infection of one of our great institutions that has now been cured by the antibiotic of traditionalism. But with me to discuss this is none other than a very distinguished former England cricketer and Surrey County cricket player, Pat Pocock. Pat, thank you for coming in.
Jacob.
Do you think the traditions of cricket are important and that historic games, historic matches ought to be retained, or am I just very old-fashioned?
You're talking about one of the most historic games there are, and played at the most beautiful cricket ground in the world. I mean, a lot of people think it is the headquarters, but it would be wrong to assess the importance of this without taking the overall picture of cricket there. As you well know, Test cricket is the skeletal of cricket, and county cricket is a skeletal of Test cricket. And you cannot go from playing the T20 matches, which is so important to us, straight into Test cricket. So therefore, you have to have a training for it. And about 50 or 60 years ago, it was proven that you cannot make the county cricket pay. But then we've had two golden geese. One is the one-day game, and the other was the T20. And without those, we wouldn't have had cricket today. But it has got so popular now, the T20, the white ball cricket, as it is now called, it's played in every country in the world. In fact, they're just about to start in the States as well with it. So therefore, they need more and more grounds, and it is absolutely vital that they should play this. It's not a game about sponsors. It's a game about keeping the tradition, but you have to have a balance. You have to have a balance of money and tradition. Fortunately, there are two brilliant people running cricket now, the chairman and the chief exec of the ECB, Richards, and they do a brilliant job, and the game is safe with them, but they are very much aware of the social of the financial element.
And T20 did amazingly. It got Lord's full for a Middlesex versus Surrey match for the first time since the 1950s, when county cricket was at its height. So the revenue from that's been very important. But as you say, first-class cricket is the nursery for Test cricket. How are we going to get our Test players if all they've done is the great swoosh of one-day cricket?
Well, it's not only this game, but they have to take in the importance of the county circuits. Fortunately, it's gone from 3 days to 4 days now, so it's been up to slightly more relevant to the Test cricket, the duration. So therefore, it's very important. Everything is a question of getting the balance right. Mm-hmm. We have to have the tradition, as you said, 200 years ago. We have to have the tradition, but unfortunately, we have to have the balance to get young kids playing it, and to the ECB. They sponsor an awful lot of teams and young people all over the country, and they do a very, very good job.
And do you think having 50 over, 20 over and 100 ball confuses things, and that actually they should settle on one of those and make that the main excitement, fizzy one-day approach?
The 100 ball, I would say that 90% of people who are in the game think that the 100 ball is excessive. And it's done a great deal of harm. I think it's taken away the concentration from the county clubs, and it's also moved the proper cricket to the extremities. I mean, we've now got an Ashes series coming up, and it's played in not much more than 10 weeks. The whole series is going to be played within a 10-week period.
So when you were a first-class cricketer, just remind everybody, your best bowling, you got how many wickets in how many balls?
Well, I got 7 wickets in 11 balls.
7 wickets in 11 balls.
But that was
heroic.
But it was. I've bowled much better than that and got naught for plenty. But it's just that every time somebody missed it, it bowled them out. Every time they nicked it, somebody caught it. Every time it went in the air, someone was underneath it. It just happened to be. I worked in golf for 24 years, and it's a bit like a hole-in-one. Skill takes it to within 5 feet, and luck takes it into the hole. Well, and exactly the same applies to my cricket.
I'm very starstruck by having somebody who got 7 wickets in 11 balls in first-class cricket. Pat, that's absolutely brilliant. The MCC, fortunately, has apologised, so I'm glad about that. Floriati Tona, thank you to Pat. That's all from us, but coming up next is Dan Wootton. So, Mr. Wootton, what have you got in your box of treasures?
Well, look, I think you'll be interested in this one, JP. You know, we spoke to Priti Patel last night about the budget, but in part 2 of our exclusive interview, she becomes one of Boris Johnson's most senior political allies to hit out at the Westminster witch hunt taking place at the Privileges Committee on Wednesday. I know you know a lot about it. And she uses a very interesting word, Jacob, collusion. So it's a fascinating interview, and I'm going to talk a lot, actually, about what's going on with Boris Johnson next week, because I believe it is outrageous.
Well, that's really important, and I expect I will agree with every word that Priti has to say. Thank you, Dan. That's all coming up after the weather, and you won't want to miss that. Thank you to all my guests tonight, and for watching. I'll be back next Monday at 8 p.m. This has been State of the Nation Tonight. Thank you for a Moggalicious week.
Hello there, I'm Greg Dewhurst. Welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. Over the next few days, it stays unsettled. We'll see showers, some longer spells of rain in places too, but there will be some sunshine and temperatures above average. Looking at the bigger picture, low pressure dominates the weather pattern as we move through the rest of the week into the weekend. Showers or longer spells of rain, some brisk winds at times too, but perhaps a drier interlude as we move into Sunday. So back to this evening, a lot of cloud across the UK, some showery outbreaks of rain